So the Supreme Court today made a ruling on the Trump immunity case. And that dealt a blow to those trying to prosecute and persecute the former president. The Supreme Court dealt a major blow today to that prosecution on charges that he sought to subvert the 2020 election. And the Supreme Court today ruled 6-3 that former presidents enjoy sweeping immunity for their acts while in office. To break it down, I asked Mark Weaver to join us. I'm Westside Jeff sitting in for Chris Kroc. Chris is back next Monday. Mark Weaver is a specialist. He is a former spokesman in the United States Department of Justice in Washington. He was in the Reagan administration, so he was involved in that. He was part of that law engagement agency when it wasn't weaponized. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. He also served as Deputy Attorney General for the state of Ohio. He's a constitutional lawyer. He teaches constitutional law across the country. He's a wonderful writer. He's written a couple great books. One of them is called A Wordsmith's Work. You can see it on Amazon. And today, in Newsweek magazine, he penned an op-ed about this very topic, about what the Supreme Court said. Mark, I'll get your reaction on that, but also I want to share that President Joe Biden, came out just a little while ago with a statement from the White House, and the OPSCOM team obviously posted this on his behalf. A tweet on X that says, Joe's comment is, "This nation was founded on the principle that there are no kings in America. Each of us is equal before the law. No one is above it, not even the President of the United States." President Biden goes on to say, with today's Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity, that fundamentally changed. Mark Weaver, give me your thoughts on what you just heard and the ruling today of the Supreme Court.
Well, I predicted this, and I think most people who look at constitutional law and practice it predicted this. The other branches have immunity from lawsuit. Congress has the speech or debate clause. The judiciary has historically been immune from lawsuits. It's obvious that the founders intended the presidency to be largely immune. Now, if you go out and do something personal, you rob a bank, you go hurt somebody personally, you're going to be prosecuted for that. But the notion of hamstringing a president by bringing prosecutions and civil lawsuits or threatening to bring them after you leave office, the founders would have never anticipated that. And so the court restored the balance of the separation of powers today.
Our listeners are very smart and very intuitive. If you, as a listener, want to weigh in on this, I'd love to hear it. You can call the phone lines at 800-288-9227, 800-288-WBAP. Garrett Tarango will answer the call and tip me off on that. Or you can reach out to me across social media at Westside Jeff. If you've got a comment for Mark or a question. He's a specialist in this area. Mark, was today's ruling a win for the office of the president? No matter the party affiliation or who holds that office, was this a win for the office of the president of the United States?
It sure is. You know, it's hard enough to get good people into public office, but the notion that you go serve as the president, which is a hard job, of course, and then be beleaguered by possible prosecutions or civil lawsuits for things you did on the job, that's enough to deter a lot of people. It's political thuggery. We've seen it against Donald Trump here for the last couple of years, brought by Joe Biden. Joe Biden criticized this decision, but once he leaves office, he's going to be darn glad that the court did what it did, because otherwise he might be finding a lot of this lawfare aimed at him.
As a former DOJ guy, Mark, do you agree that the weaponization of law enforcement has been occurring under this administration? Does it tear you apart on this? I mean, it's got to bother you.
It's horrific. This is not the America any of us grew up in. We all grew up in a country where you bring your best argument to the debate around the election. That might mean why you're good. It might mean why your opponent's bad. But the notion of trying to remove your opponent's name from the ballot, we saw that from the Democrats, and the Supreme Court struck it down. The notion of getting Democrat prosecutors in D.C., in Georgia, in New York, in Florida, trying to put the most likely next president in prison. We've never seen it before, and most of us never thought we would see it. Luckily, our system is working, and slowly but surely the courts are blowing a whistle on some of these truly unconstitutional and wrong-headed actions by Joe Biden and his allies.
That's Mark Weaver. I'm Westside Jeff. Mark, I had somebody reach out to me on social media today and say, Jeff, are we in a republic or a democracy? We're supposed to be a democracy. Which one are we in, and where are we going? How would you answer that?
Well, the Democrats are having fun with this. CNN did a story a couple of weeks ago running around trying to make fun of Trump supporters who say we're in a republic. A direct democracy, of course, is where everyone in the country votes on every issue, including all the bills in Congress. So we're certainly not a direct democracy. We're more like a representative democracy, and the name for that, the proper name for that, is a republic. And so don't take my word for it what kind of government we have. A woman in Philadelphia asked Ben Franklin as he left the Constitutional Convention, what kind of government have you given us, Dr. Franklin? And Ben Franklin, who was there for the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, looked at her and said, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. So don't take my word for it. Ben Franklin said, we live in a republic.
Mark, doesn't the ruling today about the Supreme Court protecting the immunity of a president or former president, doesn't this help Joe Biden when he gets out of office, whether it be in 6 or 8 months, 7 months, or 4 years from now?
Of course. Let me give you an example. Let's say one of the families whose loved one has been murdered by these illegal immigrants coming across the border because of Joe Biden's policies. Let's say one of them decides to file a wrongful death suit against Joe Biden with the argument of, if it hadn't been for his policies, this monster would have never come across the border and killed my loved one. Today's decision will protect Joe Biden from having to be held liable for those sort of lawsuits. He ought to be happy about it, but because everything's about get Trump, today he came out with his new orange spray tan, he meaning Joe Biden trying out the orange spray tan, and he criticized the decision, and he said a lot of things that were not true about this decision. But I think the American people will know that this was the right thing for the Supreme Court to do.
So even though the President of the United States, Joe Biden, is not adhering to laws that are on the books right now about immigration, so he's breaking them by letting anybody in and all that, he still cannot be prosecuted based off what's going on our southern border?
Not personally. The remedy here is for the courts to step in and to strike down any executive actions he has as being unconstitutional. But the ultimate remedy in a republic is for the voters to put the right people in office. And that's why everyone listening in the greater metroplex, people listening to this show, now is the time to organize your friends and families to turn out to vote and turn the country around, because ultimately we are the shareholders of this republic. And if we don't act, we can't count on government to act for us.
That's Mark Weaver. I'm Westside Jeff sitting in for Chris Crock. I got to hit a quick break on the other side of this, Mark. I saw something that really bothered me today. And talking to that constitutional lawyer, I saw an interview on CNN. I've seen it bubble up a couple times about referencing how a president could order the assassination of a foreign political opponent. And that could come under this ruling today. I want to get into that next. Sit by. We'll talk to Mark in a matter of about 3.5 minutes. I'm Westside Jeff in for Chris Crock on News Talk 820 WBAP and now on FM at 93.3. Westside Jeff is the name in for Chris Crock tonight. Chris is off this week, enjoying a week off, and I'm sitting in tonight, tomorrow, Friday, and Chris is back next Monday. Biggest news day weekend that I've experienced in my lifetime in talk show history, and potentially the biggest political news story of my lifetime is going on right now with the Biden-Trump debate the other day and the fallout, but also the Supreme Court's ruling today. The Supreme Court came out and said that that the president of the United States, no matter who it is, whether it be current President Joe Biden or former President Trump or former Presidents Obama or Clinton or Bush or the other Bush, name them, even Carter, who's still alive, believe it or not, that they cannot face prosecution for acts that they were involved in as President of the United States with official business with regard to that. I asked Mark Weaver to join me. Mark is a former spokesman with the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. He was in the Reagan administration, and he told us a moment ago he's as disgusted as I am and you are, and he sees the weaponization of law enforcement, and it's a very different law enforcement time than it was when he was there. It's changed. He's a member of the U.S. Supreme Court Bar. He teaches constitutional law. And that's important because earlier today, I saw an interview on CNN with a constitutional lawyer who teaches constitutional law at Princeton, talking about the Supreme Court ruling today and referencing the fact that it potentially gives a president. I can't believe they said this. You talk about injustices. You talk about somebody who said something they should have never got into. This is it. She said that the analyst asked and said, does this give a president the authority to assassin a political opponent, a foreign one, without fear of charges? I couldn't believe what I was listening to. And I've seen that across social media and up and down the dial yet tonight. Mark Weaver, would you spell this out for me?
We can clear this up very quickly. Here's what the decision says. If a president is doing what the Constitution says he can do, he can't be sued or prosecuted. If he's doing something that's an official duty, the presumption is that he can't be prosecuted, but that could be overcome. And then if he does something in his personal capacity, he could be prosecuted. So number one, SEAL Team 6, which doesn't exist anymore, it's called something different, but the Navy SEALs, if you ordered them to go kill somebody for no good reason, they will not follow an unconstitutional order. But even if they did, if that's not part of your job as the President of the United States, then you could be prosecuted, because the immunity today for that middle category is only presumptive. It means the burden starts on somebody saying what you did was wrong. But under this crazy hypothetical that people are using, yes, a president could be prosecuted under today's decision.
Coming up in about 7 minutes, by the way, Sean Allen in the newsroom, he's my news guy, dropped me a note, said he's got more information on Biden remarks. President Joe Biden came out in the White House just a couple hours ago and spoke on behalf of this ruling, and he's got the news on that. That's coming up in 7 minutes. It's interesting what Joe Biden had to say. Sean Allen in the newsroom's got that, and you'll hear some sound bites from that. He's also got a story about Texas A&M University looking for a new chancellor, which is interesting, on the heels of what's going on with A&M and baseball around the state. Mark, that ruling in the Supreme Court, the Democrats are out fear-mongering, and I see it all across social media. And earlier today, I saw a tweet from AOC. She said, quote, SCOTUS here's what she tweeted. SCOTUS, or Supreme Court of the United States, has become consumed by a corruption crisis beyond its control. Today's ruling represents an assault on American democracy. It is up to Congress to defend our nation from this authoritarian capture. I intend on filing articles of impeachment upon our return. Ilhan Omar, another congresswoman, tweeted something very similar. Supreme Court can no longer be trusted to uphold the Constitution. If Donald Trump is reelected, this convicted felon, rapist, and twice impeached former president of the United States will be able to do whatever the hell he wants to do. It's scary. It's a scary day for American democracy. Several other Democrats have posted similar comments also. How do you respond to that? Where do you start with that, Mark? How do you respond to that?
I'd like to think that AOC was a good bartender before she was in Congress, because we need.
I wouldn't know. I don't drink.
Well,
this might drive me to it.
I'm not much of a drinker myself, but I do know that we do need good bartenders, and perhaps she was one. But I know for sure she's not a good representative in Congress because she doesn't understand the job. She certainly doesn't understand the Constitution. And as a practical matter, if she thinks she's going to get articles of impeachment through a Republican House and then through the Senate by a supermajority, I would say she's too drunk to drive. She's the bartender that's too drunk to drive. And so this is political rhetoric meant at stirring up her small dollar fundraising and getting her more clicks on social media. If clicks on social media were votes, she'd be president of the universe right now, but they're not. And so she's not a serious person, and I don't take her seriously.
Our listeners are pretty smart people. They get a lot of the same questions I have because they've sent them to me, and there's some I'm probably not asking if they want to weigh in. I'd love to hear from you either on social media at Westside Jeff, that's on X, formerly known as Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, or just pick up the phone and call. Mark is available to take your questions. If you've got some questions of what's going on within the Biden campaign, the administration, the Supreme Court rulings, there's several of them came out today, one that impacted Texas we'll get to in just a little bit. 800-288-9227, 800-288-WBAP. Garrett will take the call. That's who you'll talk to, and he'll tip me off that you're calling. Mark, let me ask you one last question before we hit the bottom of the hour news real quick. Can Supreme Court justices be impeached? Is there? Teach me on this one. I'm missing that.
Yeah, the Constitution says that federal judges are appointed for terms of good behavior. If you want to win a bar bet somebody whether federal judges are appointed for life, and take the no side. And then when we get out the Constitution, they are appointed for terms of good behavior, which means you're in there until the House and the Senate decide that you should be impeached, which is a rare thing, but it almost happened in the early 70s when we had sort of a mentally deranged Supreme Court justice named William O. Douglas, and there was an effort in the House to impeach him, but it never went anywhere.
So the Supreme Court justice can be impeached. Does that mean they can be removed from the bench?
Yeah, that's how it would work. It would just like the way you would impeach a president, you could impeach a Supreme Court justice, and that is the only discipline that can be brought on any federal judge. Now, there's some internal discipline in the federal judiciary. They could take your caseload away. They can move your office. But you are there until and unless the House of Representatives impeaches you and the Senate of the United States removes you.
Mark Weaver is a practicing attorney. He teaches constitutional law. He's joining us. He's available for your questions if you want to weigh in at 800-288-9227. That's 800-288-WBAP. Bottom of the hour news, Sean Allen has some sound bites from President Biden at the lectern just a little while ago and his comments about the Supreme Court. On the other side of this, that's coming up in 2 minutes. On the other side of that newscast, Mark, I want to get into the Supreme Court ruling today, avoiding the decision on state regulation of social media that came here out of Texas. Just quickly talk about that, frame it, and see how it comes into play. We'll be back in about right after the bottom of the hour news coming up in about 2 minutes, and then the news. We'll be back on the other side of that. I'm Westside Jeff, and for Chris Crocker, News Talk, 820 WBAP, and now on FM at 93.3. I'm Westside Jeff, sitting in for Chris Crock. Chris is off on vacation this week. I'm in tonight, tomorrow night, and Friday night. And my story is simple. I just born and raised up in Columbus, Ohio, is where I was born and raised, and fell into radio by having an opinion. That's what talk radio is all about. I have an opinion. I have a lot of them. And I find myself watching news, following the news, and voicing my opinion on the news from multiple sources. And that landed me on the radio. And that gives me the ability to sit here and share it with you. Just a regular guy, not a professional, just, again, my opinion. And if you want to interact with me, you can catch me across social media at Westside Jeff on X, formerly known as Twitter, also on Instagram and Facebook. You can send me messages that way. Joining me is Mark Weaver. Mark is a former spokesman for the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington. He worked in the Reagan administration. He actually coached Ronald Reagan through several things. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Mark is he teaches constitutional law. And so he understands, he knows it. He also owns a company called Communications Council, which is a political consulting firm. So when you see those political ads for candidates saying, vote for me, and attack ads, whatever it may be, Mark is one of those guys that does those across the country and heavily involved in those on the Republican side. So he knows what he's doing. He's an expert in the field. He's written several books. One of them is called A Wordsmith's Work, which is a wonderful read. If you're looking for a great read, if you're looking for a gift for somebody to teach them how to handle crisis communications and how not to, check out the book, A Wordsmith's Work. You can find it on Amazon. Today, he's in Newsweek magazine. He penned an op-ed. He's a regular contributor to national media outlets about today's Supreme Court ruling on Trump immunity case. Mark, the thing I want to talk about next is another ruling that came down today. And that is the ruling that started here in Texas, also in Florida. The Texas law regulating social media platforms remains on hold. The Supreme Court stepped in, and as I read it, and I'll let you verbalize it, they pretty much agreed with Governor Greg Abbott. When Governor Abbott signed the Texas law originally, he said it was needed to protect free speech and what he termed the new public square. He said social media platforms, quote unquote, are a place for healthy public debate where information should be able to flow freely. But there's a dangerous movement by social media companies to silence conservative viewpoints and ideas. Greg Abbott went on to say that is wrong and we will not allow it in Texas. Supreme Court stood up for that today. Would you share their ruling and what that means for us here in Texas?
Well, it's too early to say the ultimate result here because the court ruled on a technical issue. It essentially said that the courts that had looked at these laws, Florida has a similar one. So the Supreme Court said that the Fifth Circuit and the 11th Circuit, 5th is Texas area, 11th is Florida area, that they had not applied the proper test with respect to whether or not these laws violate the First Amendment. And so the court gave it some guidance and sent it back. And so we will know more after the 5th Circuit Court of Appeals and the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals does their work. I will say this. Surely there has to be some ability for states to rein in what's happening with social media. We know Congress has done that over the years, and the states ought to be able to do it as well. But it is a new issue, and the question will become whether this is something better handled at the state or whether it's better handled in Congress.
So you're anticipating, Mark, that this is something similar to the abortion issue where they'll kick it back to the states and let the states decide how each state governs it?
Well, what makes it hard for something like this is questions of, let's say one state regulates a social media platform one way, and the next state over regulates that same platform in a completely different way. And those platforms now have to change their rules based on what state they're being viewed in. And so when those types of cases have come before the Supreme Court in years past, the Supreme Court has often said that those things are better handled as federal issues because of the interstate commerce that happens when you are doing business in 50 states. I'm not saying that's going to happen in this case. I'm saying that is one of the possibilities.
If you have a question for Mark, Mark is available to take some calls if you'd like to weigh in on this, or if you have a comment or a thought, things we're talking about, whether it be this case or other cases, you can jump in. 800-288-9227 is the phone number. Garrett is taking the phone calls. 800-288-WBAP. That's Mark Weaver. I'm Westside Jeff, and for Chris Kroc. Mark, how do you, this sounds like an interesting case. How do you see this playing out in the weeks and months ahead?
Which case are we talking about now?
The Texas and the social media case.
Yeah, I think we're going to see, I think we might get a different reproach from the 5th Circuit and the 11th Circuit, which means it will eventually go back to the Supreme Court. This case had the justices really all over the map. We saw Justice Kagan wrote an opinion, and of course, you wouldn't be surprised to know that although Amy Barrett joined Kagan's opinion, we have Justice Thomas and Justice Alito on a different angle here. And so I think we are still seeing laws surrounding social media and the internet beginning to gel. And I think the Supreme Court wants it to percolate down at the lower level courts first before it weighs in finally.
It's going to be interesting to see if the president or Congress weighs in on that ruling. They're too busy right now getting involved in the Supreme Court and, quote unquote, trying to impeach them for the Trump immunity trial, Trump immunity ruling today. Mark, I want to get into, I'm going to hit a break here in a matter of minutes. On the other side, I want to talk about another major news story today, one that kind of got buried unless you're really an insider on and really follow politics. And that is Steve Bannon. Bannon today reported to his sentence in Danbury, Connecticut. He's sentenced to 4 months, and coincidentally, 4 months takes us through the election. The DOJ and law enforcement, they couldn't lock up Donald Trump, but they tried with the persecution of him. So what are they doing? They're going after Trump surrogates, and Bannon is surrogate 1A. Because of his podcast, his voice, his opinions, his defense of Donald Trump. Bannon made some comments today out front of the courthouse and talked a little bit about it. I want to get into those next and your opinion on the DOJ, the weaponization of our legal system. You worked for the DOJ, and I want your input on Steve Bannon on the other side of this. Again, if you want to weigh in, give us a call, 800-288-9227, 800-288-WBAP. My name is Jeff. It's Westside Jeff, and for Chris Crock on News Talk 820 WBAP, and now on FM at 93.3. Name is Westside Jeff, sitting in for Chris Crock. Chris is back next week. A lot of significant stories we're following today that are really important to discuss. And if you'd like to weigh in, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Or if you have a question, 800-288-9227. Joining me is Mark Weaver. Mark is a former spokesman with the DOJ. He worked in the Reagan administration. He teaches constitutional law, so he knows it. He's a specialist, and he's a regular guest on national media platforms. Today, he wrote an op-ed for Newsweek magazine. You'll see his op-ed about today's Supreme Court ruling with regard to presidential immunity as it relates to Donald Trump. If you've got a question for Mark or want to weigh in with a comment about it, love to hear from you at 800-288-9227, 800-288-WBAP. Mark, earlier today, Steve Bannon reported to prison. He'll still have influence in the Trump world. He, on Friday, stated on his podcast, I think it was, "Do not write me a letter at all. It will not be read." He said it. That was on his podcast. He went on to say, you know why? He said, "I don't want you taking time to write a letter. I want you to get to work. This is all about victory." And referring to this year's presidential election, there's no substitute for victory. So he is all in on Donald Trump and supporting Donald Trump. Now, his follow-up comment about that was this. I love it. In an interview with the Wall Street Journal, he said, to the ruling class in this country, they are right. I'm a dangerous man. And guess what? I'm going to be a lot more dangerous moving forward. So they're right. He reported to prison today. He's in for 4 months. Why don't you share a little more about that story? It's coincidental he's in for 4 months because there's something around that. This is political. This is weaponization of the DOJ.
It's very obvious, and this case makes it even more obvious. Congress has the power to declare somebody who will not appear in front of it in contempt of Congress, much like a judge can declare somebody in contempt of court. Now, this was done when Barack Obama was president. In particular, Eric Holder was charged with contempt of Congress for refusing to come forward and provide evidence that the Congress needed for its oversight activities. Well, Steve Bannon didn't cooperate with Democrats in Congress. particularly around January 6th. He said there was executive privilege, and so they held him in contempt. What's the difference between Eric Holder being held in contempt and Steve Bannon? Well, the difference is that the Biden Justice Department prosecuted and sent to prison Steve Bannon, but the Obama Justice Department refused to prosecute and send to prison Eric Holder. And as a result, this is our best evidence that when it comes to Joe Biden's Justice Department, if you are a Republican, you're an enemy of the state and a potential target. And if you're a Democrat, you're somebody who needs to be protected at all costs.
And you are a former DOJ spokesman. This has got to kill you to make that statement for a department that you worked under with a president in Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, I remind people it was near the end of his administration. I was a very young man in my 20s, but it was a formative experience for me, and I really did value my time, and I thought I was doing something very important working for Ronald Reagan in his Justice Department, and I have a lot of admiration for the work that the Justice Department does typically, but it has been so weaponized and politicized by Joe Biden. I thought Barack Obama had taken it to new lows, but Biden has even beat that. And now we have people who simply don't trust the FBI or federal prosecutors, which is a terrible thing because these are good folks. I've worked with U.S. attorneys and I've worked with the FBI. By and large, these are good agencies, but at the top, they've been weaponized and twisted by politics under Joe Biden.
You worked in the DOJ, Mark. Hypothetically, it's a hypothetical question, the people running the DOJ, do they have to execute the orders of the president and of the White House? Do you think they're in agreement with what Joe is doing and weaponizing the DOJ? Think they're in kahunas with them? Or do you think they aren't, but they have to do it to keep their job? Do you have any insider opinion on that?
Different people view different things. I worked at Main Justice, which is the headquarters in D.C., and many of these people are career employees, and many of them are Democrats. And so I think a lot of them do kind of like Joe Biden. But there are lots of hardworking, particularly in the FBI agent and the line lawyers who are prosecuting around the country, who are just good Americans who they got to do it because they want to go after bad guys. They want to enforce the law. They want to do justice. And so I think it's split. The true corruption is happening amongst the Biden appointees or the people who, want to see their power protected. And they view someone like Donald Trump as a threat to their ability to stay in power.
Do you... Boy, so many questions about this. If you've got questions for Mark about this, love to hear your input. 800-288-9227, 800-288-WBAP. That's Mark Weaver. I'm Westside Jeff in for Chris Kroc. What is the exact date that Bannon gets out?
Don't know. I heard it was 4 months, but I imagine it's going to be very close to the election, and because I think there was probably some consideration of that. It's
clearly a case of the law enforcement agencies, DOJ, couldn't imprison Donald Trump, so they're going after his surrogates. If I can't get Trump, I'm taking down his lieutenants and generals and his machine. Right? Would you agree?
Sure. Well, particularly he's been a vociferous advocate for Trump. He's got a huge following on social media and on podcasts and on YouTube, probably more typically Rumble. And this is about anybody who is helping Donald Trump is a legit target. Now, again, did he not cooperate with Congress? He didn't. Did he have a reason? His reason was executive privileged. Was it litigated? It was. But the difference is we didn't see that same approach brought to Eric Holder. And that's what makes people so frustrated.
That's Mark Weaver. I'm Westside Jeff in for Chris Kroc. Coming up top of the hour, Sean Allen in the newsroom dropped a note. He's got news on what's going on with the Biden administration, with the SCOTUS, with the Supreme Court rulings, and Team Biden in the re-election campaign. That's coming up in about 3 minutes. Mark, on the other side of the newscast, I want to have you stick around and talk about the Chevron deference case, because that's very, very important, and it has implications to what we just went through with COVID. So we'll talk about that in a couple minutes.